Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're tackling a subject that sits right at the intersection of physical violence and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of it. We're really looking at how violence becomes meaningful.
And it becomes meaningful through language.
Exactly, through language.
And the book we're using to explore this, it has a really central premise.
Yeah.
That it's narrative, not just injury or death alone, that actually produces a national identity.
Yes, it's a contest of meaning.
And while we're looking back, 350 years?
About that, yeah.
The relevance is, well, it feels incredibly current. I mean, you just have to look at any modern debate over monuments or history curricula or even border disputes.
It's all the same struggle, isn't it? It's a struggle over whose story is authoritative, who gets to be the hero of the story, who's the villain, and maybe most importantly, whose story just gets completely erased.
So to be clear for everyone listening, this deep dive is going to focus on that symbolic power. On the narrative systems. We're not doing a chronological retelling of battles.
No, this isn't military history.
We're looking at the name of war, King Philip's War, and the origins of American identity by Jill Lepore.
A fascinating and, frankly, a pretty devastating piece of work.
It really is. So before we get into the core system analysis, let's just set the stage a little. Who is Jill Lepore, and what is this conflict we're talking about?
Well, Jill Lepore she's a giant in the field of early American history. But what makes her perfect for this is that she's not just a chronicler of events, she's really a historian of memory itself.
Right. She seems kind of obsessed with the history of history making.
That's the perfect way to put it. She doesn't just asking what happened in 1675, she's asking, how did the people in 1675 write about what was happening?
And how did that writing actually shape the outcome?
Yes. For her, the documents, the pamphlets, the sermons, the captivity narratives, they aren't just evidence about the war. They're a part of the war. They are weapons.
The pen wasn't mightier than the sword here. The pen was a second sword, fighting on a different battlefield.
A second sword, exactly. And the event in question is King Philip's War. It ran from roughly 1675 to 1678.
Now, for a lot of people listening, this might be a vague name from a high school history class, if it was mentioned at all.
It often gets glossed over. People think of it as, a minor colonial skirmish before the real business of the American Revolution.
But it wasn't. The stakes were incredibly high.
Unbelievably high. Lepore makes a point that is just staggering. In proportion to the population at the time, this was the most fatal war in American history.
Wait, more fatal than the Civil War? Than World War II?
Proportionally, yes. It was devastating. On the English side, dozens of towns were burned to the ground. Their society was pushed to the absolute brink of collapse.
And for the Algonquian peoples?
It was an apocalypse. The Wampanoags, the Narragansett, the Nipmucks. We're talking about the near total destruction of their world in that region.
And the central figure, the man the war is named after, is Metacom. He was the leader of the Wampanoags.
But the English called him King Philip.
And right there, just with the name, we hit our first systemic issue, don't we?
We do. And this is where you can see the crisis in perception theme right from the jump. The book is called The Name of War for a reason. Naming something isn't a neutral act, it's an act of power.
So why do we call it King Philip's War? Let's unpack that because it seems so simple, but Lepore shows us it's a trap. Let's start with king.
Was he a king? No, of course not. The colonists knew that.
So where does it come from?
Initially, it was just a loose, kind of lazy translation for sachem, which means leader or chief. But over time, especially as tensions rose, the English started using it mockingly.
Mockingly? How so?
It was a sneer. They were implying that these indigenous leaders were, playing at being European royalty in a way the English found pathetic or laughable. It diminishes him. It makes him seem like a pretender.
A sneer that somehow survived 3 centuries and ended up in our history books.
That's the power of winning the narrative war.
Okay, what about Philip? Obviously not an Algonquian name.
No, his name was Metacom. Philip was a name given to him, or perhaps his father, by the English, and this detail, I think, reveals the entire colonial mindset.
It wasn't just a random English name, was it?
No, it wasn't like they called him John or Thomas. They called him Philip in a very specific reference to the ancient Macedonian King Philip.
As in Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father.
That's the one. And you have to think about the layers of arrogance there. The English colonists, especially the educated ones, saw themselves as the new Romans or the new Greeks. They were the inheritors of classical civilization, building a new republic in the wilderness.
So if they're the Greeks, then the Indians are.
They're the Macedonians, a people on the periphery, semi-barbaric, a potential threat, but also someone to be classified and contained within their historical framework.
Wow. So they were colonizing his very identity before the first shot was even fired. They couldn't see him as Metacom, leader of the Wampanoag. They could only see him as a character in their own historical drama.
Precisely. They couldn't grant him his own context. He had to be placed into theirs.
Which brings us to the last word. War. That seems straightforward. People were fighting and dying. It was a war. Why is that word contentious?
You'd think so. But at the time, this was a subject of furious debate among the colonists. They were very reluctant to call it a war.
Why? What else would be?
Because in the 17th century European mindset, the word war implies a conflict between two sovereign, legitimate powers. It grants a certain dignity to your enemy.
Ah, I see. So if you admit you're at war with the Algonquian peoples, you're admitting that they are a nation, that they have a government, a coherent strategy, political rights.
Exactly. And the colonists did not want to admit that. They much preferred words like massacres, outrages, uprisings, or most tellingly, rebellion.
Because rebellion changes everything. If it's a rebellion, then Metacom isn't a foreign head of state. He's a traitorous subject of the English gang.
And if he's a traitor, you can execute him for treason, which is what they did. If he's a leader in a war, he's a prisoner of war and has certain rights. The semantics determined his fate. Metacom's rebellion implies he's a criminal. The Puritan conquest implies the outcome was just God's will.
But King Philip's war is the one that stuck.
It is, and the fact that we use that name today, a name that centers the English mockery of an enemy leader, proves Lepore's central point. The colonists didn't just win on the battlefield, they won the contest for meaning.
And that leads us right into the book's thesis. Lepore argues, and this is so powerful, that the violence didn't stop when the fighting stopped.
No, the violence just continued in a different form. Through stories, through texts, through symbols, the war on the page was a struggle to define who counted as civilized, who was truly native to the land, and ultimately who was going to be American.
And the primary weapon in that second phase of the war was language.
It was the only weapon that mattered in the long run.
So let's dive into that core systems analysis. Lepore uses this phrase that has really stuck with me. War cultivates language. What does she mean by that coupling of wounds and words?
It's a profound idea, almost philosophical. Think about what happens in a moment of extreme violence or pain, a wound.
Language disappears. You just scream. It's pre-verbal.
Exactly. Pain is inarticulate. Lepore's argument is that profound violence wounds shatters our reality. It destroys our ability to make sense of the world. And she uses this term, it unmakes our universe.
So violence breaks the world, and words are what we use to put it back together.
Yes, but here's the crucial part. The way we put it back together isn't neutral. That's the catch. The words we choose are a strategy. Well, let's say I kill you. That's the wound. That's the raw, chaotic event. But if I want to live with myself, and if I want my society to see me as a hero and not a murderer, I have to frame that act with words.
You have to build a story around it.
I have to build a story. If I call it justice or self-defense or God's will and you're dead and can't stand up and call it murder, then my reality, my story, is the one that becomes the historical record.
That's terrifying. It means the survivor holds a monopoly on the truth, not just because they're the only one left to tell the tale,
but because they're the one with the tools to tell it. And in 17th century New England, the ultimate survivor wasn't just the person who didn't die. It was the culture that had the printing press.
This is what she calls the literal advantage.
That's the term, yeah. It comes from Samuel Purchas, a writer from that era. The literal advantage. The English had an absolute monopoly on the technology of literacy. They had printing presses, they had paper, they had a culture of writing everything down.
And they saw the lack of this among the Algonquian peoples, not just as a difference.
Not at all. They saw it as a moral defect, a sign of being uncivilized, even subhuman. One of the phrases they used was speaking apes.
Speaking apes. That is just incredibly dehumanizing.
It's intended to be. The logic was if you don't have a written language, you don't have history, you don't have laws, you are just making sounds in the present moment like an animal.
So this belief system allowed them to just completely dismiss all the other forms of communication and record keeping the Algonquians had.
Completely. The complex oral traditions, the wampum belts, which were intricate records of treaties and history, None of it counted. If it wasn't written down in English, on paper, it simply didn't exist in their system of reality.
But here's where the story gets even more complicated and tragic.
Yeah.
Because there were Indians who were literate, the so-called praying Indians who had converted to Christianity.
Yes, a significant number of them.
Did the literal advantage help them? Did it protect them?
No. In a horrifying paradox, it actually put them in the most dangerous position of all.
How's that possible?
Well, look at the story of John Sassamon. He's really the tragic figure who sparks the entire war. He was a literate Indian. He was a translator, a preacher, a go-between. He had one foot in the Algonquian world and one foot in the English world.
Which sounds like he would be incredibly valuable, a bridge between two cultures.
In peacetime, maybe. But as tensions mounted, that middle ground became a no man's land. He was a liability to everyone.
What happened to him?
He tried to use his position as a bridge. He went to the Plymouth governor and warned him that he believed Metacom, or Philip, was planning an attack. He used his literacy to try and prevent the war.
And the English believed him.
Not really. They were suspicious. Is he a double agent? Is this an Indian trick? And then, a few days later, Sassamon's body was found under the ice of a frozen pond.
He was murdered.
Almost certainly. Likely by some of Philip's men for being an informer. The English then tried and executed 3 of Philip's advisors for the murder, and that was the final spark that ignited the war.
So his literacy didn't save him. It made him a target from both sides.
Precisely. To the Wampanoag, his literacy made him a potential traitor, someone who could give away secrets in the language of the enemy. To the English, his Indianness made him inherently untrustworthy, regardless of the skills. Literacy was fatal in a system that was collapsing into a binary of us versus them. You couldn't be both. The middle ground was eliminated.
This really brings us to the core of identity formation. We often think of war as a simple us versus them. But Lepore describes the English identity as something more complex. She calls it a triangulated self.
Yes, and this is absolutely crucial for understanding not just this war, but the American psyche that emerged from it. It wasn't just 2 points of comparison, it was 3.
Okay, so let's walk through the 3 points of the triangle.
Point 1 is the English colonists themselves. And you have to remember, they were deeply, deeply anxious. They were thousands of miles from England, living in what they considered a howling wilderness.
And their biggest fear was degenerating, right?
Yeah. It was an obsession, the fear that they would lose their civility, their religion, their very Englishness, and become savage and wild like the land and the people around them. So they're desperately trying to hold on to who they are.
Okay, so that's point 1, the anxious English self. Point 2 is the obvious one.
Point 2 is the Indian. The English viewed them as savage. That word is key. It meant wild, heathen, chaotic, ruled by passion instead of reason. They were the other that the English defined themselves against.
We are civilized because they are savage.
Exactly. But there was a third point on this triangle, one that we often forget about. Point 3 was the Spanish.
The Spanish? What on earth do they have to do with the war in New England? They're in Mexico and South America.
Geographically, yes. But in the English imagination, they were right next door. You have to remember the context of the Protestant Reformation. The English colonists were staunchly anti-Catholic, and Spain was the great Catholic enemy.
Okay, so it's a religious rivalry.
It's more than that. The English had what they called the Black Legend of Spanish conquest. They translated all these books by writers like Bartolomé de las Casas, detailing Spanish atrocities in the New World.
So what was the label they used for the Spanish? If the Indians are savage, the Spanish are.
Cruel. The Spanish were seen as cruel. The Inquisition, the torture of Indians, the brutal conquest of Mexico. It was all evidence of their inherent cruelty, which the English linked to their false Catholic religion.
So the English are trying to thread a needle here. This is fascinating.
It's the whole psychological game. They have to fight a brutal war against the Indians to survive and take their land. But they can't be too brutal, or they become just like the cruel Spanish they despise.
They're trying to tell themselves a story. We are not savage like the Indians, but we are also not cruel like the Spanish.
Precisely. They had to carve out this very narrow, imaginary path of virtue between those two extremes. Our violence is different. Our violence is righteous and controlled.
But how do you maintain that story when you're in the middle of a war for survival? When you're burning down villages and selling people into slavery? That seems, well, that seems both savage and cruel.
And that is the systemic glitch. That is the central problem their narrative has to solve. How do you commit acts of total war without becoming the very thing you define yourself against?
You use language.
You use language. You write narratives that frame your violence as divine judgment or necessary defense. You describe burning down a village full of women and children as a sorrowful providence.
While you frame the enemy's violence as barbarous outrages and fiendish cruelty.
Exactly. The physical act might be identical. An English soldier kills a child, an Indian warrior kills a child. The wound is the same. But the words attached to the wound change the meaning entirely, and, in their minds, preserve their virtuous identity.
And it wasn't just abstract words. This anxiety played out in the material culture of the war, didn't it? In things like clothes and houses.
Oh, absolutely. The English were obsessed with nakedness. They constantly wrote about the Indians being naked, physically, and by extension, spiritually. To them, nakedness represented a lack of shame, a lack of property, a lack of civilization itself.
And how did the Algonquians see the English relationship with their things?
They saw it as a weakness. They had this great mocking term for the English. They called them coatmen.
Coatman. I love that. It's so descriptive.
It's a fantastic insult, isn't it? It implies that without all their layers of fabric and material goods, the English are nothing. They're soft and vulnerable.
And this played out strategically in the war.
It did. When Algonquian warriors captured English settlers, one of the first things they often did was strip them of their clothes. Now, the English writers could only interpret this as robbery or random humiliation.
But it was more than that.
It was a deeply symbolic act. It was about stripping away the layers of Englishness to reveal the frightened, vulnerable human underneath. It was a way of saying, look, without your coat and your hat, you are just as naked as we are. You bleed just like us.
And then there were the houses. For the English, a house, a fence, it was the ultimate symbol of ownership and civilization. I have improved this land. It is mine.
It was proof they were taming the wilderness. But the Algonquians saw a landscape that didn't need fences. And the English, in turn, were literally incapable of seeing an Algonquian dwelling, a wigwam, as a home.
What did they see it as?
They described them as dens or nests. When they attacked Indian settlements, which were often fortified towns in the middle of swamps, they didn't write about attacking a town. They wrote about flushing out beasts from a den.
That perception, again, justifies everything that follows. You don't commit an atrocity when you destroy a den. You feel a sense of accomplishment.
Precisely. If you define the space as wild, you can treat the people within that space as wildlife. The language governs the perception, and the perception legitimizes the violence.
Okay, this is a perfect time to map this system out explicitly. Let's talk about the actors, their incentives, and the feedback loops that kept this machine running.
Right. So first, the actors. You have the English colonists. Their primary incentive, beyond just survival, is legitimacy. They need to justify their presence on the land and their actions, both to themselves, to God, and to the authorities back in England.
Then you have the various Algonquian peoples. They're fighting for something much more fundamental: sovereignty and cultural survival. And as we've said, they're using violence not just to kill, but as a form of communication.
A ritualized communication the English could not or would not understand.
And then there's a third crucial group of actors: the religious authorities. Men like the ministers Increase Mather and William Hubbard.
I call them the spin doctors of the 17th century. They were the interpreters-in-chief. They're the ones who take a raw act of violence, an Indian raid, an English victory, and process it through a theological filter.
So if a town gets burned down, Mather doesn't say, "Our defenses failed," he says.
He says, "This is God's judgment upon us for our sins, for wearing fashionable wigs or for not being pious enough." They interpret all violence as a message from God, which conveniently reinforces their own authority as the ones who can read God's mind.
So that sets up the feedback loop. Let's trace it. It starts with an act of violence.
Right. Let's take our earlier example. An Indian warrior strips an English captive. That's the wound.
Step 2 is narrative framing.
The English ministers and writers immediately frame this as an act of savage cruelty and barbarity. They completely ignore any possible ritual meaning or military strategy behind it. It's just proof of the Indians' innately savage nature.
Which leads to step 3, identity consolidation.
That narrative reinforces the English identity. See, we told you they were savages. We are the civilized victims here. We are the righteous ones.
And that feeling of righteous victimhood leads directly to the final step: further violence.
Because if we are the civilized victims, then any retaliation, no matter how harsh, is justified. We can execute prisoners, sell captives into slavery in the Caribbean, destroy entire villages. But we're not being cruel like the Spanish.
Because our violence is divinely sanctioned. It's pest control.
It's a self-perpetuating, self-justifying machine. Violence creates the need for a story, the story reinforces an identity, and that identity gives permission for more violence.
There is one case study in the book that illustrates this entire system so chillingly. It's the scene Lepore calls the circle of torture. It felt like the moment the mask slips.
It is one of the most revealing and disturbing passages in the entire historical record of the war. It's late in the war, July 1676. The English and their Indian allies, the Mohegans, have just captured a Narragansett man, a leader.
So important to remember, the Mohegans are an Algonquian group fighting with the English against the other Algonquian groups.
Yes, these alliances were complex. And the Mohegans want to execute this captive in their traditional manner, which involves ritual torture.
And the English, what do?
They let them. But they don't just let them. They participate as spectators. They stand in a circle and watch as the Mohegans slowly dismember this man while he is still alive.
Now think back to our triangulated self. This is a moment of extreme crisis for their identity, isn't it?
A total systemic glitch. If they, as Christians, stand by and watch torture, aren't they becoming just like the cruel Spanish they built their identity against? Or if they find any gratification in it, aren't they becoming like the savage Indians?
As one event threatens to collapse their entire self-perception. So how do they resolve this contradiction?
William Hubbard, the minister and historian, writes about it. And the way he writes it is a masterclass in narrative deflection and moral laundering.
What do we do?
First, he frames the English as completely passive observers. He writes that they only allowed it to happen to gratify their allies.
So it's framed as a diplomatic necessity. We didn't want to, but we had to be polite hosts to our Mohegan friends.
Exactly. We were just being culturally sensitive. It's absurd. Second, and this is the most critical move, he dehumanizes the victim.
How?
The Narragansett man, while being tortured, having his fingers cut off, being flayed alive, doesn't scream. He stoically mocks his torturers. In his own culture, this is an act of immense bravery. It's the ultimate warrior's death.
But that's not how Hubbard frames it.
Hubbard writes that the man must be a monster and a beast because he doesn't seem to feel pain like a normal human. He says the man was so tough, he did not feel the contents of his body drop out after they were cut out.
Wow. So by turning the victim into an inhuman monster, it makes the act of watching him be tortured acceptable.
Well, it excuses the English spectatorship entirely. If the victim isn't human, then it's not really torture. And by making the Mohegans the active agents of the violence, the English get to consume the spectacle of it without taking any moral responsibility. They remain civilized observers.
That is just, it's a perfect, horrifying example of how the narrative was as important as the battle.
It had to be, because it determined their legal rights to the land, their political standing, and most importantly, their theological standing with their God. If they admitted they were cruel, they were damned. If they wrote the story this way, they were saved.
This brings us perfectly to the next major system the book explores, memory. We tend to think of history as this static thing that happened in the past. But Lepore shows that the memory of King Philip's War was incredibly fluid. It kept changing based on what the country needed at the time.
Absolutely. Memory isn't static, it's recursive.
Yeah.
It's a system that constantly loops back on itself, reinterpreting the past to serve the needs of the present. The truth of this war was completely reinvented at least 3 major times.
Okay, let's walk through those phases. Phase 1 is the immediate aftermath in the 1670s and 80s. How is Philip remembered then?
Then there's no ambiguity whatsoever. Philip, or Metacom, is a blasphemous leviathan, a hellhound. He is a diabolical monster, an agent of Satan sent to test God's chosen people.
So he's the ultimate villain.
The ultimate villain. He had to be destroyed to preserve the Puritan city on a hill. The narratives from that time, like Mary Rowlandson's, are all about surviving the demonic savagery of the Indians.
Okay, pretty straightforward. But then we jump forward 100 years. It's the 1770s. The American Revolution is brewing.
And suddenly, the colonists need a new story. They're no longer fighting Indians, they're fighting the British. They need a symbol of heroic resistance against a tyrannical king.
And they reach back into their own history and pull out King Philip, the guy their great-grandparents called a devil.
Unbelievably, yes. The script gets completely flipped. In pamphlets and speeches from the Revolutionary era, Philip is resurrected as a tragic hero, a patriot fighting for his land and liberty against an oppressive foreign power.
The mental gymnastics there are just astounding. So now Philip is the proto-American patriot.
And the British are cast in the role of the cruel, savage tyrants. The colonists start identifying with the Indians' struggle for freedom.
Which is deeply ironic, given that they are still actively fighting and displacing actual Indians on the western frontier.
That's the core irony of it all. Think about the Boston Tea Party. Why did they dress up as Mohawk Indians? It was a way of appropriating the idea of native liberty, of being of this land, to assert their new American identity against the British. Philip becomes a convenient and safely dead prop for American independence.
Which brings us to phase 3. We move into the 1830s, the Jacksonian era. This is where it gets even more complex and, in a way, more cynical.
This is the era of the play Metamora.
Right, Metamora, or The Last of the Wampanoags. Tell us about this.
It was a massively popular stage play. A white actor, a big star named Edwin Forrest, played a highly romanticized, heroic, muscular version of Metacom. Think of a 19th century Hollywood blockbuster.
And there's a famous scene at the end of the play, right?
There is. Metamora, defeated, stands on a cliff and delivers this thunderous curse upon the white man and his descendants for destroying his people.
And the white audiences in Boston and New York, how do they react to being cursed by this character?
They burst into thunderous applause. They gave standing ovations. They loved it.
Why? Why on earth would they cheer for a character damning them?
Because by the 1830s, the myth of the vanishing Indian was in full swing. This was the exact same time as Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. The Trail of Tears was happening as this play was being performed.
So, celebrating a dead, romanticized Indian hero on stage
Allowed them to feel noble and even a little sad about the tragic but inevitable disappearance of the Indians, while the federal government was actively and brutally forcing living Indians off their land in the Southeast.
It's a way to manage the cognitive dissonance. We feel so deeply for the plight of the noble savage of the past, so don't ask us about the Cherokee being marched to Oklahoma today.
Exactly. It frames the entire process as a kind of natural historical destiny rather than a deliberate government policy. If Metamora is the last of the Wampanoags, then the story is over. There are no more left to worry about. The tragedy makes the audience feel morally elevated, even as they benefit from the real-world outcome.
And speaking of these recursive loops and the technology of it all, we have to talk about one specific person. Lepore highlights. James Printer. His story just encapsulates the whole tragedy of the literal advantage.
James Printer is the personification of the entire book's thesis. He was a Nipmuc Indian from one of the praying towns. He converted to Christianity, and he learned a trade.
He learned how to operate a printing press, hence the name.
He was an apprentice at the press in Cambridge. He was one of the very few people, English or Indian, with that skill. Then the war breaks out. He is either captured by hostile Indians or willingly joins them. The record is unclear.
And then what?
Towards the end of the war, he surrenders to the English. And to save his own life, he is put back to work at the printing press. And what is he printing?
He's printing the very books that are codifying the image of his own people as demonic savages.
It's almost certain that he physically set the type for Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, the single most influential piece of anti-Indian propaganda to come out of the war.
So you have an Indian man arranging the lead letters one by one to spell out words like S-A-V-A-G-E to describe his own relatives.
Can you imagine the psychological horror of that? It's the ultimate recursive loop. The technology of literacy forces the subjugated person to become an active participant in their own culture's erasure. He had to print the lies to stay alive.
It shows that literacy wasn't a neutral skill. It was a weapon system. And for him, it became a trap.
The ultimate trap.
So let's bring all of this into the present day. What are the lasting implications of these systems? Why does a war from 1675 still matter in our world today?
Well, first and foremost, it helps explain the bedrock of our national myths. That triangulated identity, we are not savage like the Indians and not cruel like the European powers, that evolved directly into a certain kind of American exceptionalism. We still define ourselves by what we are not.
And that vanishing Indian myth that was so popular in the 1830s, it certainly didn't vanish, did it?
Not at all. It persists everywhere, often in subtle ways. It's in our sports mascots, in our Thanksgiving pageants. Lepore ends her book by talking about seeing a sign for the King Philip Inn.
Yeah, a motel named after the man the colonists beheaded and whose head they displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years.
Exactly. It turns the brutal reality of the war into a quaint, commercialized brand. It defangs the history, it strips the name of its violence and turns it into a commodity. It reassures us that the conflict is over, the natives have vanished, and now it's safe to, check in and get some ice from the machine.
But the story isn't actually over. This is where the pushback comes in.
It is not over, and this is the hopeful part of the story. You have modern sovereignty and narrative reclamation movements. The descendants of the people in this war, the Narragansett, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, are still here.
And they're actively fighting to reclaim their own narrative.
They are. They are moving their story from one of vanishing to one of persisting. They are using the very tools that were once used against them: historical research, legal challenges, writing to challenge the dominant narrative.
They are fighting back against the literal advantage.
They are. They are pointing to the historical record and saying, this is what you wrote about us. Now let us tell you our story. Through our oral traditions, through our language, through our continued presence on this land. It's a new contest for meaning happening right now.
This connects so perfectly and so powerfully to the whole theme of our channel, to the crisis in perception.
It really does, because the core lesson from this book is that perception is governed before it is debated. The colonists couldn't see Algonquian warfare as strategic. Their perceptual system, filtered through the Bible and their own anxieties, could literally only process it as savage or satanic.
Their system of perception dictated their reality.
And that reality then justified their actions.
And the other core theme, language stabilizes violence.
That's the line to remember from all of this. Violence is chaos. It throws everything into question. It destabilizes society. The act of writing the story of King Philip's War, framing it as a heroic Puritan victory against savagery, stabilized that chaos. It erased the terrifying reality that their society had nearly been destroyed and turned it into a triumphant origin story.
So identity isn't something organic, something that just springs from the soil. It's something that is written into existence.
It emerges from interpretation. American identity wasn't found in the wilderness. It was painstakingly constructed by distinguishing us from them, using very specific, very powerful words like cruelty and savagery.
So as we start to wrap this up, what does this book help us see differently? Let's start with war itself. It's clearly not just a clash of armies.
No. Lepore forces us to see war as a clash of world-making systems. It's a fight to the death over whose version of reality, whose entire cosmology will prevail and be passed down.
And history. History is not just what happened.
History is who had the tools, the literacy, the printing presses, the power to record what happened. It's a record of the stories the winners told themselves.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on.
Oh.
We've spent this time talking about how wounds and words were inseparable back in 1675.
Right.
But if we apply that system to today, how are our current global conflicts being written in real time, right now, on our screens?
And who holds the literal advantage today? Is it the state with the most powerful media apparatus? Is it the algorithm that promotes certain stories over others, and whose reality, whose suffering is being systematically erased because they don't have the power to command the narrative?
That is definitely something to sit with.
It is.
We want to give full and clear credit to Jill Lepore for her absolutely incredible book, The Name of War. If any of this has resonated with you, please go read it, borrow it from your library. It's dense, but it will fundamentally change how you see American history.
It is absolutely essential reading.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
And if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.